His mistake was in front of everyone. On the big night of the Entrepreneur of the Year awards in Sao Paulo, the arrogant CEO Roberto was about to receive the top prize. When a waitress bumped into his table, he publicly humiliated her, saying she almost ruined everything. Minutes later, the host called to the stage the anonymous judge who decided the winner. And to Roberto's horror, it was the waitress who started walking toward the stage. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel glittered under the weight of crystal chandeliers that poured a golden light upon the nation's financial elite. The air vibrated with the murmur of business deals and the early celebration of a victory everyone considered a certainty. It was the grand awards night for Entrepreneur of the Year, and at the center of this opulent universe, Robert Alcott was the sun. Seated at the head table, he was the undisputed favorite, a man whose colossal fortune, built on audacious stock market investments and a relentless nose for profit, made him a living legend. His table was surrounded by a retinue of sycophants, men and women who laughed at his humorless jokes and hung on his every word, hoping to absorb a fraction of his brilliance, his aura of incontestable power. Robert, in his bespoke Italian suit and a smile that never reached his cold eyes, soaked in the adulation as if it were his birthright. His net worth was a monument to his own ego, and this night was to be his coronation, the public proof that he was, in fact, the best. Moving with a quiet grace between the tables, almost invisible amidst so much glamour, was Elisa Morgan. Dressed in the discreet uniform of the catering staff, she served glasses of champagne with an efficiency that masked the storm of observations in her mind. Every smile, every handshake, every whispered conversation was a piece of data she processed. As she approached Robert's table, she felt the heavy energy of the arrogance that emanated from him. A guest, gesturing enthusiastically while telling a story, bumped her arm. It was a minimal touch, an almost imperceptible jolt, but enough for a single drop of ice-cold water, condensed on the tray, to fall and land dangerously close to the lapel of Robert's suit. The mistake was trivial, an accident any reasonable person would ignore. But Robert was not reasonable. His reaction was like thunder cracking through the evening spell. "You incompetent fool," he yelled, his voice slicing through the ballroom's murmur and commanding a shocked silence. Every head turned in his direction. "Look what you did. You nearly ruined my night. Do you know what this suit costs? More than you'll make in your entire life. Security. Get this useless woman out of my sight." The humiliation was instant, public, and total. Elisa felt the heat rise to her face, not from shame, but from a cold, controlled fury. She remained motionless, holding his gaze, as the faces around her watched with a mixture of pity and contempt. Robert's universe, built on the solid foundation of his capital, did not allow for flaws, especially from someone he considered insignificant. Before the security guards could take a single step, the presenter's voice boomed through the sound system, powerful and clear. And now, the moment we've all been waiting for, to present the coveted Entrepreneur of the Year award. Let's call to the stage the person whose vote carries 90% of the weight in the final decision. She has been among us all year, undercover, evaluating not just the numbers and profitability, but the character of our finalists. Please give a warm round of applause to our anonymous evaluator, Elisa Morgan. The name hung in the air for an instant of collective confusion, which soon morphed into a gasp of astonishment. Robert's reaction was total paralysis, the color draining from his face. He watched in absolute shock as the waitress he had just humiliated handed her tray to an assistant who had appeared at her side. With unnerving calm, she removed her apron, revealing an elegant haute couture dress underneath. She ascended the stage steps, accepted the microphone and the sealed envelope. From the podium, Elisa looked directly at Robert, who was as pale as a ghost. The Entrepreneur of the Year award is for a leader, she said, her voice firm and clear, echoing through the tomb-like silence of the ballroom. And a true leader knows that a person's character is measured by how they treat those who, supposedly, can do nothing for them. Mr. Robert Alcott has given us a rather clear demonstration of his character tonight. Then, with a deliberate gesture, she tore the envelope in half without even opening it. The sound of the ripping paper was the only noise in the room. The awards committee has decided that this year, for the first time in our history, the award will not be given. The title of Entrepreneur of the Year is officially vacant. Robert's jaw dropped. But what broke him inside wasn't the loss of the trophy. It was Elisa's gaze, a look that held no anger or triumph, but something infinitely more devastating, a deep and irrevocable disappointment. The silence that followed Elisa's declaration was more deafening than any applause. It was a vacuum filled by hundreds of stares, all fixed on Robert. The same faces that had adored him minutes before now regarded him with a mixture of shock, contempt, and, in some, a poorly disguised satisfaction. The air around his table grew thin. His friends and associates subtly shifted away, creating a circle of isolation around him. Every second he remained there, frozen in his chair, was a new layer of humiliation being applied to his skin. The multimillionaire, the titan of business, had been reduced to a spectacle. With a monumental effort, Robert stood up. His legs felt like lead. He looked at no one, keeping his chin held high by pure instinct, a final remnant of pride. He walked toward the exit, his firm strides belying the chaos raging in his mind. The path to the door seemed like running the gauntlet, each step a small eternity under the weight of silent judgment. Outside, the camera flashes exploded like grenades, but he saw nothing, blinded by the fury and shame that consumed him. Inside the car, the cold leather of the seat offered no comfort. The silence was an accusation. He looked out the window at the city he considered his playground, the lights of the buildings representing the empires, the deals, the vast wealth he had striven so hard to accumulate. His fortune wasn't just money, it was proof of his worth. The armor that protected him, and that woman, that waitress, had found a chink and pierced it with a single, precise thrust. Upon arriving at his penthouse, a glass and steel palace overlooking the city skyline, the sense of power the place always gave him had vanished. The apartment, usually a sanctuary to his success, now felt like a gilded cage. He tore off his jacket, the very one that had been the trigger for his ruin, and threw it violently to the floor. A crystal glass was next, shattering against the wall into 1,000 pieces, a reflection of how he felt inside. But the rage did not fill the void. For the first time in decades, Robert felt small, powerless. All his money, all his fortune could not erase what had happened. Meanwhile, on stage, Elisa was surrounded by members of the awards committee. Men and women who controlled vast capital and investment funds now shook her hand, their eyes filled with a newfound respect. "You did the right thing, Elisa," said a white-haired gentleman, the awards founder. "Nay, you reminded all of us that the integrity of a business begins with the integrity of its leader." Elisa acknowledged him with a nod, her expression serene. She felt no joy at Robert's downfall, only a profound melancholy. Her year-long mission, living simply, observing the finalists up close in their natural habitats, was not a witch hunt. It was a search for a genuine leader, someone whose wealth lay not just in their financial assets, but in their character. Robert had failed the most fundamental test, and the weight of that failure, for her, was a tragedy. She had hoped to find a hero, but instead, she had been forced to expose a man who had become lost in his own arrogance. High above the city, Robert ignored the insistent buzzing of his cell phone. He knew it was news, analysis, questions from the press. He didn't want to talk to anyone. He wanted to erase the night, to turn back time. but the device wouldn't stop. Finally, annoyed, he answered it, ready to unleash his fury on whoever was on the other end. It was Myers, his right-hand man, the one who managed his most complex investments. His voice, however, was not that of a fearful subordinate, but of a messenger of the apocalypse. "Robert, you need to see this," Myers said, the urgency in his tone cutting through the fog of rage. "The video, it's everywhere already. It's gone global." Robert remained silent, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs. "The international markets," Myers continued, his voice faltering for a moment. "Our stocks, Robert, they're in freefall on the Asian markets. We're losing millions of dollars a minute." Myers' words fell like death sentences into the silence of the penthouse. Millions of dollars a minute. The phrase echoed in Robert's mind, each syllable a hammer blow against the structure of his empire. He ran to his office, a sanctuary of technology and power, and switched on the massive screen that covered an entire wall. Usually, it displayed green graphs of ascent, the steady flow of profit that fed his ego. Now, it was awash in a bloody red. Lines that once pointed to the heavens now plunged toward an abyss. The stocks of his companies, the pillars of his immense fortune, were collapsing in real time as the Asian exchanges opened their trading day. The market wasn't just reacting, it was passing judgment. His reputation, the most valuable asset he possessed, had become his greatest liability. "Do something, Myers," he growled into the phone, his voice hoarse with panic. "Call our traders, inject capital, support the price." On the other end of the line, Myers' silence was more eloquent than any response. "Robert, this isn't a cash flow problem," he said finally, his voice tired. "And it's a confidence problem. No investment can fix this. The video, it doesn't show a business mistake. It shows who you are. The investors are scared. If you treat a waitress like that in public, how must you treat your partners and employees behind closed doors?" The logic was irrefutable, and it enraged Robert even more. He slammed the phone down on Myers and began to pace, a caged animal in his own creation. He would not be defeated. He had built his empire from nothing, fought in a market of sharks and won. He would not let some woman in a nice dress and a moralizing speech destroy everything. Grabbing the phone again, he started calling his network, the powerful men whose pockets he had lined with generous dividends over the years. The first didn't answer. The second went straight to voicemail. The third, a banker in Geneva, picked up, but his voice was cold and distant. "It's a regrettable situation, Robert. We'll be monitoring the market," he said, offering empty words instead of the action Robert demanded. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. He was alone. The capital he so idolized was cowardly and disloyal. As long as he was a winner, everyone wanted a piece of his glory. Now that he had stumbled, no one wanted to be dragged down with him. He sank into his Italian leather chair, defeated, and watched the red numbers on the screen. Each percentage point drop represented hospitals he'd built, foundations he'd funded, the legacy he believed he was solidifying. It was all turning to digital dust because of a single drop of water and his own uncontrollable arrogance. The irony was so bitter he almost laughed. He, who managed billions, who moved markets with a single phone call, had been brought down by an event that had nothing to do with the profitability of his businesses. Miles away, in a simple, anonymous hotel room, Elisa Morgan was carefully folding the waitress uniform. She placed it in a box, alongside other disguises she had used throughout the year. A janitor's jumpsuit, the simple clothes of a volunteer at one of the shelters funded by Robert. On the bed lay a dossier. Inside were reports, notes, and a single old photograph, slightly faded at the edges. It showed a smiling, humble-looking couple in front of a small country house. They were her parents. And the small house was the property Robert's company had taken years ago in an aggressive legal maneuver that had left them with nothing. Her mission wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. The award was merely the stage. The justice she sought was for that memory, for that smile that Robert's money and greed had erased. Back in the penthouse, Robert's phone rang again. It was his personal number, not the business line. A number he didn't recognize. He answered, his voice harsh. "What is it?" For a moment, there was only the sound of hesitant breathing on the other end. Then, a soft, trembling female voice that seemed to come from another life, from a past he had buried under layers of wealth and success. "Robbie, it's me." Lucia. The childhood nickname hit him with unexpected force. Lucia, his sister. He hadn't spoken to her in almost 15 years, not since she had refused to sell her share of the family inheritance, their father's small bookstore, so he could turn it into another one of his profitable ventures. "What do you want?" he managed to say, his throat suddenly dry. Her voice trembled a little more. "I saw what happened on the news. Robbie, I need help. Not for me. It's for Mom. Mom!" The word felt foreign on Robert's lips, an artifact from a language he no longer spoke. His mind, trained to identify risk and opportunity in fractions of a second, immediately catalogued Lucia's call as a new threat. It was opportunism. It had to be. She saw the news, saw his public vulnerability, and now she was coming for something. 15 years of silence weren't broken by mere concern. They were broken by need. "And how much do you need?" he asked, his voice cold and sharp, reducing her sudden reappearance to a simple financial transaction. He figured the old bookstore, the foolish business she had refused to sell, was finally failing. He would wire the money, solve the problem, and get back to staunching the bleeding of his empire. A small sum to silence the past. There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a weary sigh. The sound of patience that had been stretched to its limit. "It's not about money, Robbie," Lucia said, and the way she used his childhood nickname again was like a small knife twisting in an old wound. "It's not something your dollars can fix. Mom, she's not well. It's been happening for a while, but it's gotten much worse." Robert felt a pang of irritation. Family dramas were liabilities he had cleared from his personal balance sheet long ago. "Get to the point." "Lucia, what's wrong with her?" His sister's voice wavered, losing its firmness. "She's forgetting us. Things. Sometimes she doesn't know where she is or who I am. She gets lost inside her own house. The doctor said that her memory is fading, like an old photograph left in the sun." Robert processed the information with a clinical distance. A health problem. There were solutions for that. "Hire the best nurse," he commanded, as if closing a deal. "I put her in the best facility in the country. I'll pay. Send the bill to my office. Consider it handled." He expected a sigh of relief, perhaps a reluctant thank you. Instead, what came was a choked sob, a sound of pure frustration. "She doesn't need your money, Robbie. She needs her son. She doesn't recognize the nurses. She gets scared. But sometimes, in the middle of the confusion, she calls for you. She asks when Robbie is coming home." That information pierced his armor in a way the crash of his stocks couldn't. He remembered a distant afternoon, a scraped knee after falling off his bike, and his mother hugging him, telling him everything would be okay because he was her strong boy. For an instant, the billionaire gave way to that scared child. The doctor said that familiar faces, old memories, might help. Lucia continued, her voice thick with emotion. "It might not be a cure, but it could bring her comfort. It could anchor her for a few moments. Your presence would be a treatment, Robbie." Robert looked at the wall of red screens, the chaos, the humiliation, the evaporating fortune. "You don't understand, Lucia. My world is collapsing here. I can't just drop everything to hold someone's hand." It was the truth. But saying it aloud, he tasted the bitter selfishness on his own tongue. "I understand better than you think," she replied, her voice suddenly gaining a steely strength. "I've been holding her hand alone for years while you were building your house of cards. I only called because I thought that maybe, just maybe, the man I once knew was still in there somewhere." He stood in silence, not knowing what to say. The implied accusation in her words was more painful than the public shaming. Lucia took a deep breath, as if making a final decision. Look, I can't do this alone anymore. The business is barely holding on, and Mom needs full-time care. I'm going to have to sell the bookstore. The announcement caught him by surprise. The bookstore was her life, the last remnant of their father. I already have a buyer. We're signing the papers on Friday. With the money, I'll hire help and dedicate myself to her. If you want to see her before she completely forgets who you are, before the last piece of our family disappears forever, you have until then to come here. The call ended, leaving a silence that was heavier than any boardrooms. The screen in front of him showed a financial disaster, but the echo of his sister's words spoke of a bankruptcy far deeper and far more terrifying. The next morning dawned cold and grey, a perfect reflection of the state of Robert's soul and his empire. The pale light filtering through the penthouse's panoramic windows revealed a man who had not slept. The screens, which he hadn't had the courage to turn off, continued to glow with the relentless red of financial catastrophe. Each new opening bell on the European exchanges carved a new wound in his net worth, which was slipping through his fingers like sand. His advisors bombarded him with messages, demanding a plan, a public statement, anything to stanch the hemorrhage. But Robert's mind wasn't on the complex algorithms of the stock market or on damage control strategies. It was trapped by the echo of his sister's voice and an image he had tried to erase for 15 years, his mother's face. He stood up, ignoring the frantic buzzing of his cell phone. He walked to the bar and poured himself a glass of water, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at his reflection in the dark glass of a cabinet, but barely recognized himself. The man staring back looked haunted, his eyes hollow. The mask of invincibility cracked. Lucia's ultimatum, "You have until Friday," was a different kind of deadline, one that couldn't be renegotiated with interest or extended with a new investment. It was a deadline on his humanity, on an impulse that defied all the business logic that had governed his life. He grabbed the key to one of his cars, not the chauffeured limousine, but a discreet sedan he rarely used. He called Myers, his voice firm for the first time in hours. "Cancel all my meetings. I'll be out of touch for the rest of the day." Myers protested, talking about the need to reassure investors about the capital that had to be protected. "Protect what you can," Robert cut him off. "I have a personal liability to deal with." The drive out of the metropolis was a transition to another world. The glass and steel skyscrapers, monuments to wealth and ambition, gradually gave way to lower buildings, then to houses with yards, and finally to a landscape of green fields and old trees. As he drove, a flashback hit him with the force of a collision. He was maybe 10, sitting on the steps of the old bookstore, the smell of paper and dust in the air. His mother was sitting beside him, reading him an adventure story. Her voice was the safe harbor of his childhood. He remembered thinking that when he grew up, he would buy her all the books in the world. The memory was so vivid, so full of a warmth he hadn't felt in years, that his eyes burned. The relentless pursuit of more money, of more power, had started as a twisted desire to fulfill that childish promise. But somewhere along the way, he had forgotten the why entirely. While Robert journeyed toward his past, Elisa Morgan was journeying into it. In a quiet room in the public records office of Robert's hometown, she scanned microfilms of old property deeds. The dossier she had compiled on him was extensive, detailing every deal, every acquisition, but the transaction involving her parents' land had always puzzled her. It seemed too brutally simple. And there, in the dust of the past, she found it. It wasn't just Robert's signature on the foreclosure documents. There was a second name, a silent partner in the firm that made the initial acquisition, a name that didn't appear in any of Robert's modern corporate filings: Arthur Maddox. The name meant nothing to her, but the instinct that had guided her all year told her it was a critical piece of the puzzle. Robert arrived in his hometown in the middle of the afternoon. The place seemed frozen in time, immune to his transformative influence. He parked across the street, his heart pounding erratically. There it was, Alcott Books. The wooden facade was faded, the letters on the sign a bit crooked. It was small, insignificant, the opposite of everything he had built. It was the 0 point of his life, the place he had fled to build his fortune. He sat in the car for long minutes, a war raging inside him. Pride versus remorse, the present versus the past. Finally, with his breath caught in his throat, he opened the car door. He took a step toward the sidewalk, toward the bookstore's entrance. At that exact moment, his personal phone, the one he'd kept on knee, buzzed with a violent urgency. It was a notification from his private Swiss bank. The message was short, brutal, and final. Credit line revoked, asset liquidation imminent. His last financial shield, his final safety net, had just been cut. The message on the phone was an obituary. Asset liquidation imminent. Each word was a nail in the coffin of the empire he had built. The Swiss bank, the guardian of his most secret fortune, the safe harbor for his capital in times of crisis, was turning on him. It was the end of the line. The man who calculated the value of everything in dollars and cents suddenly found himself without a price, without value. For a long, terrifying moment, Robert stood frozen, hand on the car door, the sound of the small town's traffic muffled, as if coming from underwater. Instinct, sharpened by years of corporate battles, screamed at him to go back, to fly to Geneva, to fight, to intimidate, to do what he had always done. But what was the point? The blow wasn't financial, it was existential. He wasn't losing money, he was losing himself. With a slow, deliberate motion, he put the phone in his pocket. The liquidation of his assets seemed, in that instant, a distant, abstract problem. The faded wooden building across the street, the bookstore of his childhood, was the only thing that was real. He closed the car door and crossed the street, each step a renunciation of the man he had been the night before. The bell above the door chimed with a familiar tinkle that echoed in some forgotten corner of his memory. The air smelled of old paper, binding glue, and the faint scent of chamomile tea. It was the smell of home, a concept he had long associated with luxury penthouses and bank vaults. Behind a dark wooden counter, stacking books with a tired resignation, was Lucia. She looked older than he remembered, with fine lines of worry etched around her eyes, but those same eyes still held the stubborn flame of defiance he knew so well. She saw him, and there was no surprise, no relief, just a quiet acceptance. "You came?" she said, her voice flat. It wasn't a question, but a statement. "I said I would," he replied, the sentence sounding hollow even to his own ears. He looked around. The shelves were half empty, with gaps where bestsellers should be. The children's section, once vibrant, looked neglected. This business wasn't just failing, it was dying. "I can help," he said. The old habit of solving everything with money speaking up. "I can cover the losses, inject capital." Lucia let out a short, mirthless laugh. "You still don't get it, do you? The problem was never cash flow, Robbie. The problem is I can't be in two places at once. I can't run a business and care for a mother who sometimes wakes up and thinks Dad is just late for dinner." The picture she painted with her words hit him with physical force. He tried to imagine his mother, the strong, pragmatic woman of his memory, lost in a labyrinth of time and confusion. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice little more than a whisper. Lucia motioned with her head toward a doorway in the back, covered by a beaded curtain. "She's resting. The doctor said the agitation makes her exhausted." She stared at him, her eyes narrowed, piercing his defenses. "Do you really want to see her? Or did you just come here to clear your conscience before going back to your deals and your millions?" The accusation hung in the air, and for the first time, he had no arrogant retort, no defense. He was a defendant with no argument, his emotional equity as zeroed out as his bank accounts would soon be. He just nodded, an almost imperceptible movement. Lucia sighed, a sound that contained 15 years of hurt. Fine, but don't scare her. Be gentle, if you even remember how. He approached the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound of the wooden beads clacking against each other as he pushed them aside sounded like a countdown. The back room was small, dimly lit by a table lamp. There was a bed, an armchair, and the smell of lavender. Sitting in the armchair, her back to the door, was a small, frail woman looking out the window. Her hair was completely white. He opened his mouth to say, "Mom," but the sound wouldn't come out. It was as if the word had been torn from him. At that exact moment, as if sensing his presence, the figure turned slowly. The face was his mother's, but the eyes were vacant, lost in a place he couldn't reach. She looked directly at him, with no sign of recognition. Then, a flicker, a momentary spark in the depths of that fog. Her lips curved into a confused, childlike smile. "Sir," she said, her voice as fragile as thin glass, "can you tell me what time my Robbie gets home?" His mother's question, so simple and innocent, was the final blow that shattered what was left of Robert's world. "Sir, can you tell me what time my Robbie gets home?" He, the multimillionaire, the titan of business, was a nobody here. He was a stranger in whose face his own mother searched for the son he had ceased to be. The Robbie she waited for was a ghost, a memory of a boy with scraped knees and promises to buy all the books in the world, a boy who had been buried under decades of relentless ambition and the single-minded pursuit of a fortune that now proved worthless. He felt the floor disappear from beneath him. The pain was so sharp, so visceral, that he had to lean against the doorframe to keep from falling. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. What could he say? "I'm here." It would be a lie. The man standing there was not her son. He was just the empty shell he had left behind. Lucia entered the room silently, carrying a cup of tea. She stopped when she saw the scene. Her brother paralyzed by grief, and their mother looking at him with a vague, polite curiosity, as if at a delivery man. There was no triumph in Lucia's eyes, only a deep, shared sorrow. She placed the cup on the small table next to her mother, who gave her a sweet, absent smile. "Lucia, my dear, this kind gentleman was asking about Robbie," the old woman said, her voice a whisper. Robert recoiled, backing out of the room as if he had trespassed on hallowed ground. He returned to the dimness of the bookstore, the smell of old paper now suffocating him. He felt like an imposter in his own story. When Lucia came back out, she found him standing in the middle of the main aisle, staring at the empty shelves as if looking at the skeleton of his own life. "Don't sell," he said, his voice hoarse, almost unrecognizable. It was the first time he hadn't given an order but made a plea. Lucia crossed her arms, exhaustion hardening her features. "And what's your grand solution? Are you going to use part of your vast fortune to save us, buy the building and turn it into another one of your cold investments?" The bitterness in her voice was justified, but Robert didn't flinch. He looked at her, and for the first time in 15 years, she saw not the CEO, but the scared older brother she thought she had lost forever. "I have nothing left, Lucia," he confessed, the words tearing at his throat. "The money. It's gone. The empire. It's collapsed. That night, I didn't just lose an award, I lost everything." The revelation hung in the dusty air between them. Lucia studied him, searching for any sign of deceit, but found only genuine desolation. The mighty Robert Alcott was broken. As the foundation of Robert's life dissolved, Elisa Morgan followed the loose thread she had found. In her hotel room, surrounded by documents, she typed Arthur Maddox into a search engine. The first results were vague. an aggressive businessman from the 90s, a pioneer in hostile takeovers. Then, an old business journal article caught her eye. The headline read, "The Titans Split: Why Robert Alcott Ousted His Mentor." The article detailed the early partnership between a young, ambitious Robert and the experienced, ruthless Arthur Maddox. Together, they built the foundations of Robert's empire. Arthur was the brain behind the most brutal strategies. The partnership ended abruptly, with veiled accusations and a multi-million-dollar non-disclosure agreement that made Arthur Maddox vanish completely from the business world. The missing piece of Elisa's puzzle wasn't just a name, it was a ghost, and she had a terrible feeling that this ghost was about to return. Back in the bookstore, the silence between the Alcott siblings was heavy with the weight of unspoken years and an uncertain future. Robert took a step forward, his vulnerability raw on his face. "Let me stay," he pleaded. "Let me help, not with money, I don't have any, but with my hands, with my time. I'll carry boxes, I'll clean the floors, anything. I need to try to fix this for her." He was offering the only thing he had left, his presence. Lucia stared at him, a storm of conflicting emotions in her eyes: anger, pity, mistrust, and a flicker of hope. Just as she opened her mouth to answer, the shop bell clanged loudly, breaking the spell. A man in an expensive suit and an oily smile walked in, holding a leather briefcase. He ignored Robert and addressed Lucia directly. "Miss Alcott, it's me, the buyer. I've come for the final signing. As per our agreement, as of today, this place is mine." The presence of the buyer, a man named Sykes, filled the small bookstore with a predatory energy. He was the embodiment of the world Robert had just left behind, a world where assets were measured in square footage and profit potential, and where history was just an obstacle to be demolished. Robert felt a chill. He knew men like Sykes. He had been a man like Sykes. Instinct took over. "The sale is off," Robert declared, stepping forward, his voice carrying an echo of his former authority. Sykes looked at him, a sneer forming on his lips. And who are you?" he scoffed. "The security guard. As far as I know, my business is with Miss Alcott." Then a flicker of recognition crossed his eyes. "Wait a minute. I know you. You're Robert Alcott, the ex-billionaire. Saw it on the internet. Quite a fall, huh? From hero of capital to what exactly?" The humiliation was salt in an open wound, but Robert didn't back down. "This bookstore is a family inheritance. It's not for sale." Sykes laughed out loud. "Look, Alcott, your name isn't worth anything in business circles anymore, and it certainly isn't worth anything here. I have a contract, signed. Miss Alcott just needs to initial the last page, and the money, a sum, by the way, I doubt you still possess, will be transferred." He snapped open the leather briefcase on the counter, revealing the papers and pushing them toward Lucia. "Come on, dear, it's just a signature. Forget your washed-up brother. Think about the future, your mother's comfort." Every word was calculated to undermine the fragile reunion between the siblings. Lucia looked from Robert, whose face was pale with fury and impotence, to the papers that promised an easy solution to her overwhelming problems. Logic, responsibility, everything screamed for her to sign. While the battle for the soul of the bookstore unfolded, Elisa Morgan was in a noisy coffee shop. Laptop open and phone pressed to her ear. After hours of digging, she had finally located a former lawyer for Arthur Maddox's firm. The man, now retired, spoke reluctantly, fearful of the long reach of an old NDA. "Maddox was brilliant," the lawyer said, his voice low, "but he was a demolition man. He didn't build, he took. His specialty was finding the structural weakness in a company and pushing until it all collapsed. Then buying the wreckage for pennies on the dollar. That's what he taught Robert." Elisa felt a chill. "And what happened between them?" she asked. There was a long pause. "Robert learned the lesson too well. He used Maddox's own tactic against him, forcing him out of his own company. Maddox swore revenge. He said that one day he would take from Robert not just his assets, but his identity. He would make him forget who he was, just as the world would forget him. The words echoed in Elisa's mind, make him forget who he was. It was a revenge of an almost poetic cruelty, considering the state of Robert's mother. Back in the bookstore, Sykes picked up a pen and offered it to Lucia. "Think carefully," he said, his voice slick. "This place is falling apart. I have big plans. I'm going to demolish it all. Build a small, modern, profitable retail center. Progress can't wait for nostalgia." The word demolish hit Robert like a punch. He looked at the walls filled with stories, at the spot where his mother used to read to him, and imagined it all being reduced to dust and rubble. Desperation gave him a clarity he'd never had. He turned to Lucia, ignoring Sykes completely. His voice wasn't that of a CEO, nor of an arrogant brother. It was the voice of a man pleading for one last chance. "Lucia, please, don't sign. I know I have no right to ask for anything. I abandoned you. I abandoned Mom. But I'm here now. If you sell this place, you're not just selling a building. You're selling the last thing that still connects us. You're selling Dad's memory and Mom's last refuge. Sykes's money will run out, but we're family. Give me a chance to prove that. 1 week. That's all I ask. 1 week to show you that I can be useful, that I can help take care of her. If in 1 week I haven't made a difference, I'll drive you to sign it myself." Lucia looked at her brother's face, at the raw sincerity in his eyes. Then she looked at the pen in Sykes's hand, its plastic gleam promising security and an end to her worries. Behind the beaded curtain, she could hear the soft murmur of her mother, humming a lullaby from decades ago. Her heart was being torn in two. Time seemed to freeze in that instant. The plastic pen in Sykes's hand was an offer of peace, an end to Lucia's daily struggle. Her brother's face was a promise of pain, of uncertainty, but also of a reconnection she had thought impossible. She glanced toward the beaded curtain, toward the fragile world that existed behind it. The sound of her mother's voice, an echo of the past, was the deciding factor. With a slow movement, she pushed the leather briefcase back toward Sykes, her hand trembling slightly. 1 week, she said, her voice low but firm. "You'll have your answer in 1 week." Sykes's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of restrained fury. "That's not part of our agreement. My investors don't like delays. They have a strict timeline for their return on capital." He looked at Robert with pure contempt. "You're making a huge mistake, Miss Alcott, listening to a man whose judgment drove him into bankruptcy." He packed away his papers with sharp, angry movements and headed for the door. 1 week, he spat, "but the price might not be the same." The threat hung in the air long after the bell announced his departure. The silence he left behind was heavy and uncomfortable. Lucia didn't look at Robert. She turned and began to straighten a crooked stack of books, a small gesture to fill an enormous space. Robert stood there, feeling both victorious and terrified. He had bought time, but what would he do with it? "And thank you," he whispered. Lucia didn't answer immediately. "Don't thank me yet," she said finally, without turning around. "You made a promise. Now keep it. The stockroom is a disaster. Old boxes, unsellable books, 30 years of dust. Start there. I want it all cleaned and organized by the end of the day." It was a test, and they both knew it. She was giving him a menial task, a job to put him in his place. The old Robert would have scoffed, would have called an assistant. The new Robert just nodded. Okay. The stockroom was a tomb of forgotten memories. Cardboard boxes collapsed under the weight of time, and a thick layer of dust coated everything, shimmering in the few rays of light that pierced a filthy window. Robert, in his $1,000 suit, looked absurdly out of place. He took off his jacket, rolled up the sleeves of his silk shirt, and began. It was clumsy, humiliating work. He didn't know where to start. Every box he opened was a nostalgic trap. In one, he found his old report cards. In another, a drawing he had made of his father, with the caption, "The best dad in the world." He sat down on the dusty floor, holding the yellowed paper, and felt the weight of his betrayal of that boy, of that father. He wasn't just cleaning a stockroom. He was excavating the ruins of his own life, confronting the assets of love and family he had liquidated in exchange for stocks and dividends. While Robert wrestled with dust and ghosts, Elisa Morgan was following Sykes's digital trail. His company was a shell, funded by a labyrinth of investment vehicles. Using financial data analysis software normally used to track illicit crypto and capital flows, she began to peel back the layers. Finally, she found what she was looking for, the primary source of the funding. The war chest fueling Sykes's operations came from a discreet and exclusive private equity fund called Maddox Capital. Arthur Maddox's revenge wasn't just an old threat. It was an ongoing business, and Alcott Books was its next target. Late in the afternoon, Lucia entered the stockroom. She found Robert covered in dirt from head to toe, his hair white with dust, his expensive shirt stained and torn, but the chaos from before had been replaced by a precarious order. The boxes were stacked, the trash separated. He was exhausted, but there was a glint of purpose in his eyes that she hadn't seen since they were children. The ice around her heart melted a millimeter. Before she could say anything, a sharp cry came from the back room. "No, not again." It was their mother's voice, filled with a terrifying panic. They ran to the room and found her standing by the armchair, clutching a small, empty wooden box. Her eyes, once lost, now burned with a frightening clarity. She looked directly at Robert, but she didn't see him. She saw someone else, a ghost from a time of pain. "He took it," she whispered, her body trembling. "He took our treasure. You promised you wouldn't let him." The panic in his mother's eyes was a flame burning through the fog of her illness. Lucia rushed to her side, wrapping a gentle arm around her frail shoulders. "It's okay, Mom. It's all right. It was just a bad dream," she whispered, her soft voice trying to weave a veil of calm over the terrifying memory that had surfaced. But Mrs. Alcott would not be soothed. She clung to the empty wooden box as if it were an anchor in a sea of confusion, her eyes still fixed on Robert, but looking through him to a time of desperation. "He promised he would take care of it," she murmured, her voice choked with tears. "Your father. He said Robbie would be the guardian. But the bad man took it. He took our future." Robert stood frozen, her words striking him like accusations from a forgotten tribunal. Guardian, bad man, future. They were pieces of a puzzle he didn't know existed. He felt the weight of a broken promise, one he couldn't even remember making. Slowly, with the patience born of years of practice, Lucia managed to guide her mother back to the armchair. She began talking about simple things, the taste of her tea, the color of the flowers in the garden, the melody of an old song. Gradually, the storm in her mother's mind subsided, the agitation giving way to a deep exhaustion. Soon she was asleep, the wooden box still held tightly in her lap. Lucia covered her with a shawl and joined Robert in the bookstore, her face creased with worry. "This has been happening more often," she said, her voice low and tired. "She goes back to that time. The time when Dad got sick and the business started to fail." Robert felt his throat go dry. "What is that box? What does she mean by treasure?" Lucia sighed, sinking onto a stool behind the counter. "I don't know exactly. It was Dad's. He called it the box for our tomorrow. He said that inside it was something more valuable than gold, something that would secure our future. He guarded it with his life." She paused, her eyes lost in memory. Just after he was gone in all the chaos, the box disappeared. Mom has always believed someone stole it during one of the days the creditors came around. She never got over it, and she always connected the loss to your failure to protect us. Dad made you promise you would look after us, Robbie. You were 17. It was too heavy a burden, I know. But she held on to that. Robert felt a wave of nausea. He vaguely remembered the promise, made at his father's bedside. But the memory was a blur, obscured by the pain and rage of his youthful helplessness. His desperate quest for wealth, for power, hadn't just been ambition. It had been a twisted, disastrous attempt to fulfill that promise. He had wanted to build a wall of money so high that no bad man could ever climb it. In the process, he had become the bad man himself. Thousands of miles away, Elisa's intuition led her to cross-reference Maddox's capital with property records from the Alcott's hometown in the 90s. The pattern that emerged was clear and sinister. Small property owners, all facing temporary financial hardship, had been squeezed by a small investment firm, the same one that took her parents' land, with identical tactics, short-term, high-interest loans followed by swift, brutal foreclosures. Among the names, she found Robert's father, who had lost a small plot of land on the edge of town. The company that had executed all these foreclosures was the original firm of Robert Alcott and Arthur Maddox. Elisa understood everything. Maddox's revenge wasn't just against Robert. It was the completion of an old plan. He was wiping out the last trace of the Alcott family, just as he had done to her family and so many others. In the bookstore, the weight of the revelation settled over Robert. "We have to find out what was in that box," he said, a new urgency in his voice. This was no longer about money or business. It was about reclaiming a lost honor, about understanding what his father had considered the family's true fortune. "It's the only way we might bring her some peace." Lucia looked at him, seeing not a fallen billionaire, but a brother trying to find his way back. "There's nothing left, Robbie. The box is gone." Robert searched his memory, forcing himself back to that dark time. Dad was methodical. He wouldn't have put all his eggs in one basket. He must have kept something else, some papers, records. Lucia shook her head, then stopped. A distant memory surfaced. "There is one thing," she said, hesitating, "an old metal box in the attic. He always said it was just old papers, worthless loan guarantees. It's been locked for decades." Without another word, they headed for the dusty stairs to the attic, a fragile, desperate hope uniting them for the first time in years. The attic stairs groaned in protest under Robert's weight, each step a moan of old wood. The air up there was thick and still, heavy with the smell of time and stored memories. A single dusty sunbeam from a small skylight cut through the darkness, illuminating a graveyard of objects covered in white sheets, like sleeping ghosts. Lucia followed him, and for a moment they stood in silence, siblings united in the twilight of their own past. There was Robert's old crib, Lucia's rocking horse, the stacks of newspapers their father never threw away. It was an archive of a life they had both, in different ways, tried to forget. "The box is over there," Lucia whispered, pointing to a dark corner under the eaves. It was an olive-green metal box, its edges dented and a rusty padlock on its hasp. Robert dragged it into the center of the attic, into the light. The padlock was old and solid. "We need a key," Lucia said. "Dad never told us where he kept it." Robert stared at the lock, an obstacle so small yet so impassable. In his old world, he would have had a locksmith appear in minutes. Here, he was helpless. Frustration took hold. With a grunt, he grabbed an old crowbar that was leaning against the wall and, to Lucia's surprise, began to pry at the latch. It was brutish, clumsy work. He was sweating, his shirt sticking to his back, the dust making him cough. Finally, with a metallic crack that sounded like a gunshot in the stillness, the lock broke. For an instant, Robert stood panting, looking at his own hands, dirty and scraped. They were the hands of a laborer, not a financier. With his heart pounding, he lifted the lid. The disappointment was immediate. Inside, there was nothing that looked like a treasure. Just bundles of yellowed papers tied with string, most of them appearing to be expired insurance policies and, as their father had said, old, worthless loan guarantees. "That's it," Lucia said, hope wilting in her voice. Robert didn't answer. With a care he didn't know he possessed, he began to examine the bundles one by one. His mind, trained to find value where no one else saw it, to read the fine print of complex contracts, was running on instinct. And then, at the very bottom of the box, he found it. It wasn't an ordinary paper. It was a thick parchment, folded several times with a broken wax seal. He unfolded it carefully. The ink was faded, the calligraphy elegant but difficult to read. It was a property deed. "What is it?" Lucia asked, moving closer. Robert traced the document with his finger. "This isn't a modern deed of sale," he said, excitement growing in his voice. "This is an original land grant, given to our great-great-grandfather when the town was founded. Lucia, Dad didn't buy this plot of land, he inherited it. We don't just own the building, we own the land. This is our root, our real inheritance." A wave of relief and amazement washed over Lucia's face. It was a weapon they hadn't known they possessed, a claim stronger than any of Sykes's contracts. But Robert's excitement faded as he reached the end of the document. "There's a problem," he said, his brow furrowed. "The original grant covered this lot and the adjacent land, the same land that my first company foreclosed on legally. They might still be connected." The irony was cruel. His first big business move, the act that had set him on the path to fortune under Maddox's tutelage, now threatened to destroy his only chance at redemption. They descended from the attic, the precious parchment in Robert's hands, the reality of the situation hitting them. They had a defense, but it was a complicated one, tying them to a painful past. They stood in the middle of the bookstore, the late afternoon light streaming through the front window, the future of the place as fragile as the ancient paper they held. Suddenly, the shop bell rang with an abrupt, aggressive force. It wasn't a customer, it was Sykes, and he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a man with a clipboard. Sykes's smile was gone, replaced by a cold look of triumph. He didn't address Lucia, but Robert. "I told you the price might change," he said. "My client grew tired of waiting." He held up a document with an official seal. "Your time is up. This is an assessment order for eminent domain seizure, based on an old debt recorded against this property. You have 24 hours to cooperate, or we will be forced to have you removed." The seizure order was a cold, bureaucratic weapon, more lethal than any physical threat. The legal jargon, the clauses and official seals formed an impenetrable barrier. Sykes savored the moment, the triumph of a predator cornering its prey. The man with the clipboard, an appraiser, was already looking around with an air of professional disinterest, mentally measuring the space for demolition. The fragile hope Robert and Lucia had found in the attic dissolved like smoke. Lucia felt her legs buckle, the strength that had sustained her for so many years finally giving out. She leaned against the counter, the weight of defeat crushing her shoulders. But Robert reacted in a way no one expected. The panic gave way to an icy calm. The mind that had been trained to dissect multi-million-dollar contracts in minutes switched on out of pure survival instinct. "Let me see that," he said to Sykes, his voice devoid of emotion. He took the document. His eyes flew over the text, ignoring the intimidating language and going straight to the heart of the matter. Old debt, cross-collateralization, rolling default. The pieces clicked into place in his mind with horrifying clarity. This wasn't just any debt, it was the debt, their father's original debt on the adjacent lot, which he himself, in his ambition-blinded youth, had foreclosed on. Somewhere in the fine print of the original loan agreement, a cunning clause, a Maddox specialty, must have tied this property in as secondary collateral, A legal time bomb, left ticking for decades, waiting for the right moment to detonate. How? Lucia whispered, her voice trembling as she saw the color drain from her brother's face. How can they do this? Robert looked up from the paper. The mask of calm broke, revealing pure agony. He had to tell her the truth. The confession was the last and heaviest part of his penance. "Because of me," he said, his voice broken. "The company that issued this debt, that drafted this contract, it was mine, Lucia, my first one, the one I started with Arthur Maddox." The revelation hit Lucia with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't an anonymous enemy. The architect of their final ruin was her own brother. Her entire life of struggle, the sacrifice to keep the bookstore, to care for their mother, was all being destroyed by a seed Robert had planted at the very beginning of his journey to wealth. The tears she had held back for so long finally streamed down her face. "So it was you all along," she said, not with anger, but with infinite pain. "The bad man from Mom's memory. It was always you." "Touching," Sykes interjected, sarcasm dripping from every syllable. "A family reunion, but the clock is ticking. The appraiser needs to get started." He motioned to the other man, who took a step forward. The end had come. There was nothing left to do. Robert had failed. He had not only failed to save his family, he was the cause of its destruction. He closed his eyes, waiting for the next step, the final surrender. And then, for the third time that fateful day, the bell on the bookstore door chimed. This time, the sound wasn't aggressive like Sykes's, nor hesitant. It was a clear, deliberate sound. A woman walked in. She was dressed simply, but with an unmistakable authority. It was Elisa Morgan. She ignored Sykes and the appraiser, her eyes fixed on Robert. "I thought I might find you here," she said, her voice calm and steady. "I know who's behind all of this, Mr. Alcott. His name is Arthur Maddox." She glanced at the document in Robert's hands, then at Sykes's triumphant expression. "And his revenge, like any investment built on hatred, has a flaw. I think I know how we can use his own capital against him." The arrival of Elisa Morgan was like a sudden shift in atmospheric pressure, the herald of either a storm or a clear sky. Sykes looked her over with disdain, dismissing her as an irrelevant intruder in his moment of triumph. "And who might you be? The lawyer for the bankrupt?" he scoffed. Elisa ignored him, her focus entirely on Robert. "Arthur Maddox always had a method," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "He built his fortune by preying on the distress of good people. He'd offer them loans that looked like salvation but contained poison pills, legal traps designed to fail. He did it to my family years ago, taking the land that was all we had. The humiliation you suffered at the plaza wasn't the beginning of your downfall, Mr. Alcott. It was the signal for Maddox to execute the final move in a revenge he's been planning for 15 years. Elisa's personal revelation filled in the gaps, connecting Robert's past to his present in a devastating way. He finally understood that he wasn't just a target. He was the last in a long line of victims. His revenge is an investment, like any of his other deals, Elisa continued. And arrogance is a liability that can bankrupt any fund. Maddox was meticulous in his financial strategy, but he assumed no one would bother to research the history, to read the town meeting minutes from a century ago. She nodded toward the yellowed parchment in Robert's hands. "The flaw in his plan isn't in the debt contract. It's right there, in your family's root." It was as if a key turned in Robert's mind. The brain that had been dormant in a fog of guilt and despair suddenly reignited with its old, incisive clarity. He placed Sykes's seizure order on the counter next to his great-great-grandfather's land grant. The words, once obscure, now shone with a new, powerful meaning. Grant bestowed for the purpose of a homestead and the establishment of a small family trade. And on Sykes's order, execution of cross-collateralized debt on a commercial asset. He looked up, not at Sykes, but at Lucia, and for the first time in days, a glint of genuine hope lit up his eyes. "Now, he can't touch this place," Robert said, his voice firm, regaining an authority that came not from money, but from knowledge. "He can't," Sykes let out a laugh. "You're delusional. The contract is ironclad." Robert shook his head, a faint smile forming on his lips. "The contract is perfect, Sykes. I know, I helped write it. It was designed to seize any commercial asset from a debtor. But this place," he gently touched the parchment, "is not, and has never been, primarily a commercial asset. By the founding law of this town, a law no one ever bothered to repeal, any property established under an original homestead grant is considered a family homestead. The bookstore is a legal extension of our home, and a family homestead, as any half-decent lawyer knows, cannot be seized to settle commercial debt." The silence that followed was absolute. Maddox's trap, so brilliant and complex, had been disarmed by a historical detail. His arrogance had prevented him from seeing. Their father's real treasure wasn't gold or stocks, it was history itself, the root that made them untouchable. Sykes's face went from scorn to disbelief and, finally, to impotent rage. He knew Robert was right. The man he had come to humiliate was the only one who could have spotted that flaw. He snatched his papers, muttered a curse, and stormed out of the bookstore, defeated. The appraiser followed, leaving behind a stillness filled with astonishment. The threat was gone. Lucia looked at her brother. The tears that were once of pain, now of overwhelming relief. You saved us," she whispered. Robert shook his head, the weight of his past still visible in his eyes. "No," he said softly. "I just started to fix what I broke." He turned to Elisa, gratitude and remorse mingling in his gaze. "I'm sorry for your family. I didn't know. Or maybe I didn't want to know." Elisa offered him a small smile, a gesture of peace. "Justice, sometimes, isn't about punishing the guilty," she said, "but about restoring what was lost." And in that moment, in the old bookstore, something of immense value had, indeed, been restored. When the door closed, leaving behind the echo of Sykes's defeat, a deep and transformative silence filled the bookstore. It was not an empty silence, but a sacred space where the past and future met. Lucia looked at her brother, and for the first time in 15 years, she didn't see the arrogant billionaire or the stranger who had abandoned her. She saw Robbie, the boy who had once promised to protect his family. The tears in her eyes were no longer of pain, but of a catharsis that washed away decades of resentment. With a hesitant step, she came closer and, in a gesture that broke down every barrier, she hugged him. Robert, tense at first, surrendered to the embrace, resting his head on his sister's shoulder, feeling the crushing weight of his empire of solitude finally collapse. In that moment, he didn't have a penny to his name, but he felt like the richest man in the world. Several months later, Alcott Books was breathing with new life. The shelves weren't filled with shiny bestsellers, but with carefully selected classics and works by local authors. The smell of dust had been replaced by the aroma of fresh coffee and polished wood. Robert, wearing a simple cotton apron over a plain shirt, moved through the space with a quiet familiarity. He was no longer a titan commanding deals from an ivory tower. He was a man rediscovering the value of placing a book in a child's hands, of chatting with neighborhood seniors about their favorite reads. He had traded the pursuit of dividends for the profitability of the soul. His former cash flow was zero, but his inner wealth was growing with the compound interest of small gestures and human connections. The greatest transformation, however, was happening in the small back room. Their mother still drifted through the mists of her memory, but her storms of panic had calmed. She now spent her afternoons in her armchair, no longer staring at an empty window, but listening to her son's voice. Robert would spend hours reading to her, not stock reports, but the same adventure stories she had read to him in his childhood. In her most lucid moments, she would look at him, a glimmer of recognition in her eyes, and say, "You have the same voice as my Robbie." And for Robert, that sentence was worth more than the entire fortune he had lost. He was there, fulfilling the promise he had made as a boy, not by buying her all the books in the world, but by giving her back the worlds that existed within them. On a sunny spring afternoon, Elisa Morgan walked into the bookstore, not as an evaluator or an investigator, but as a customer. She watched Robert help an elderly woman find a book of poetry and smiled. She approached the counter where Lucia stood. "I heard you started a foundation," Elisa said. Lucia nodded, her face lit with a serene pride. "It's a small project. We use part of the space to teach adults to read. Robert uses his old contacts not to ask for investments, but to get book donations. He says the real capital is knowledge." Later that evening, after they had closed the shop, Robert and Lucia sat in silence, drinking tea. It had been a good day. The foundation was gaining momentum, and the bookstore, while not wildly profitable, was a sustainable business, a beacon for the community. Robert looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the front window. The man staring back didn't have the cold gleam of success, but the soft warmth of peace. He had been humiliated